Now you might have come to this video and clicked on this title because you wanted to hear me talk about why to cull bucks from the herd, remove a buck from the herd because it's not good enough. And we'll get to reasons to shoot a quote cull buck here in a little bit, but there's a lot of reasons that you shouldn't ever even have to consider shooting a quote cull buck from your herd that you manage, that you hunt, that you enjoy hunting on a yearly basis. Now, we're out here scouting on this property. It's early January, and unfortunately we ran into this buck. Now, a lot of people, we look at this buck, I'm disappointed that I see him dead here because this is a buck we could have shot in 3 or 4 years. I could care less that he's a spike and he has a couple little points started down here. You know, just because he's a spike doesn't always mean he's going to be a spike. There's so much evidence, and I would think that most of you know that by now, but I see comments where people are shooting spikes purely because they want to cull that buck from the herd. And in a lot of areas of low habitat in the country, spikes can make up approximately 50% of the entire buck herd. So imagine if we removed every spike we saw in some of those locations. I could say down in portions of Texas, maybe Kentucky, Rocky Mountain, Hill Country, Pennsylvania Northwoods, the UP of Michigan, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. If we focused on quote culling spikes and getting them out of the herd, we could be removing 50% of an entire age class because spikes are average for those areas. And so just because it's a spike doesn't mean it's going to be a spike forever. And in fact, there's a lot of spikes on record that have grown to be Boone and Crockett bucks. And even if they are inferior spikes, there's evidence, I think it was down in Texas, they talked about that might have been a 15-inch difference. So at maturity, they might have been average 140, 145 as a 5-6-year-old instead of 160, 165 on a heavily managed property. But even then, I think a lot of us would be happy with a 140-inch buck that was 5 years old. I know I would. That'd be an awesome buck to shoot. You know, a typical 8, typical 10, whatever it is, just because it was a spike for some lower inferiority, but they find that that's just not true. You know, to successfully, another really interesting fact and tidbit is that if you're actually trying to remove and cull a buck and remove that gene from the gene pool, it takes, on a fenced-in property, if you had total control and you could actually investigate and discover the genetic makeup of those deer, it would take shooting every deer with that genetic disposition all the way through for 13 years, every buck, every doe on that property. That's not my research, but that's research that was given to me by a leading authority. But you really would have to focus on bucks and does. Does carry carry those genes just as much as bucks. So just because you're calling that buck doesn't really mean much. Your ability to do that in the free world, in the wild, is so slim, I wouldn't focus on it. You know, it gets me going. I saw a TV show the other day where they shot a small buck that was wandering by, and they said they had to cull it out of the herd. Now, my experience, it looked like a 2-year-old 8-point. Looked like a nice little buck. It probably had huge potential to be if it was 4 or 5. A lot of times calling a buck, like in the case of that show, what I believe anyways, and what I was looking at, is just, they just wanted an excuse to shoot that deer. Now at the same time, another deer research fact that I've heard is whatever gene is in the area right now has been there for decades. Whatever gene was there 50 years ago is there today. So really hard to take those genes out of the gene pool, focusing on those spikes. And you know, another thing too, this is a yearling buck. You know, I hear a lot of people refer to, you know, a fawn as a yearling. Yearlings are 1.5-year-old deer, fawns 6 months old. So to have a 1.5-year-old deer with these antlers right here is not a bad start around here. Yeah, we have more, but there's a couple of little kickers right here, and the spikes are fairly long. You know, who knows what will develop, and this could really literally be a Boone and Crockett buck, but I would imagine that on average around here you'd still be a 150-inch buck at maturity, maybe even 160. Gets down to, why would you ever cull a buck? Well, on fenced operations, you could maybe limit that gene if you tried. But what I see, one of the main reasons to cull a buck is, first off, he's injured. And so if you see an injured buck of any age, and you want to put him out of his misery, then that's a great choice and a very honorable thing to do with your tag, is to shoot that deer and cull him from the herd. Now, secondly, a reason to shoot a cull buck, and I have seen this on some of the properties I manage that have a large supply of 5, 6, 7-year-old bucks in the area on their property, and they even have some whoppers at 180 to 200 inches every single year. And yes, there are those properties. It just takes age in the right area, and they can get to that size a lot easier than you think. But they can also become a clean 150, 60-inch 8-point, which, again, you know, many of us would love to shoot. I'd love to shoot that buck. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those bucks in any way, but they can become bully bucks. And so on a 200-acre parcel, that buck can become so territorial and so aggressive, and then the landowners aren't shooting them because they're focusing on these other bucks, that now you have this buck that's a problem buck, and he's actually pushing other mature bucks off, especially during the daylight, on that land, let's say 100 acres, 200 acres, 80 acres, and he's very aggressive. And if you have that high-end management, which I do have clients that have that, then that's a good reason to call a buck. That's an acceptable reason for sure. And then lastly, shooting a buck like this, and I wouldn't even call it culling. Maybe you want to do it just for fun. Maybe you're a young hunter, maybe you're an inexperienced hunter, maybe that's just you only have a few days to hunt every year. You have a buck that walks by like this, and you have an opportunity at him, and you want some venison. You're not out there enough to shoot some does too, and you see a buck like this, you're on public land. I mean, more power to you. I look at it like in an area like this where we have a lot of older bucks. If my neighbor wanted to shoot some of these smaller ones, so be it. There's more bucks that are at 3, 4, 5 years old that will make it to that next age class then. And yeah, he won't have that start to get there, but hey, if you have fun shooting on this, and this is the you know, what you want to focus your hunting efforts on, and you know, I'm not going to say anything negative about that. That's purely understandable completely too. Just because it's a spike, just because it doesn't look like it has that potential, I can't tell you how many bucks I've seen that are actually inferior bucks based on antler and size that still go 130, 120, 150 at 5, 6 years old, and they are the monster 6-point with giant bases, 24 inches wide, no brow tines, a clean 8. Shoot, I shot a buck up in the UP of Michigan on public land. It was close to 150 as an 8-point. And in some areas that would have been an inferior buck that someone might want to call out of the whole herd. Maybe it was a bully buck. Think about that. You know, if you came to this for why to cull bucks, there's really not a lot of reason to do so unless you're actually enjoy shooting these bucks, it's injured, or maybe it's one of those rare bully bucks on a rare high-end property that you own. Think about culling bucks. Think about, more often than not, it's better off to let that buck grow, see what his potential is, and I think most of you would be very, very surprised what that spike turns into, or that clean 8 or 6-point as a 2-year-old turns into when they get to 4 and 5 years old. You might really enjoy that buck and enjoy that hunt, and taking that opportunity away 3 or 4 years earlier may not be the best thing to do if you're considering that age is ultimately the #1 factor for determining the quality of antlers on a buck.